So, what's the big battleground likely to be at the next election? Above stopping the boats and even the NHS, it's the economy, stupid, in the immortal words of Bill Clinton. Sky-high inflation rates mean our money's not going as far as it used to, as wage increases are outstripped by rising prices, and we're all having to cut back, with many families in the north really struggling. But is there an end in sight now for the UK's economic pain? And will people living in the north see the same kind of recovery as those in London and the southeast? As a wider point, are the efforts by the government to level up and tackle regional inequalities having any impact at all on the economic prospects of towns, cities, and villages in our region? We've got a great expert guest to answer those questions and more in the shape of Simon French, the chief economist of Panmure Gordon, an investment bank with a big office in Leeds. Originally from Hull, he has had a distinguished government career, including as Chief of Staff to the government's Chief Operating Officer, and had a central role in implementing the coalition government spending reforms between 2010 and 2014. So, Simon, welcome to our podcast.
Thank you, Rob. What an intro. I can only disappoint from this point forward, but looking forward to it.
I'm sure you won't. I'm sure you won't. So I know you and others, obviously, have been keeping a keen eye on what's going on under the bonnet of the UK's economy, and it's something so many of us are going to be affected by. And as we're recording this podcast, UK wages have apparently surged at their fastest rate on record outside of the pandemic, reinforcing fears that interest rates will have to rise further. So I'm really interested to know from your perspective how you see the economic recovery, if there's going to be one, going in the next few months in the run up to the election. As I mentioned, are the signs looking positive in terms of the cost of living crisis and how the government is sort of doing in terms of steadying the ship and helping us, helping our prospects?
Yeah, so it's a very good summary of where we are at, and let me add some colour as to what to expect over the next probably year to 18 months in the run up to the next general election. The first thing to say, and it is an important checkpoint on the economy, is that things look far more positive sat here today in June 2023 than they did, let's say, in November or December 2022, just 6-7 months ago. And why is that? Well, the gas price particularly, which has been so key for so many of the listeners to this podcast in terms of their energy bills, but also the costs of doing business for entrepreneurs across the north of England. Those gas prices have come down dramatically since the back end of last year. Now, many listeners haven't yet felt it in their energy bills that they get from their supplier, but they will starting in July, on the 1st of July, and then again in September. Those energy bills, the average we're paying for each kilowatt hour of electricity and gas will come down quite substantially. And therefore, households will start to feel the rate of price increases, their disposable income at the end of the month will start to increase. And that's the good news story versus where we were going into last winter. But, and you knew there was a but coming, didn't you? There's still a real challenge of the fact that prices are up between 20 and 25% since the start of the pandemic across the full basket of things that people buy. And these are pretty challenging conditions, particularly for those on fixed incomes and low incomes to navigate because they're concentrated on things that it's quite difficult to substitute out of food and energy, quite difficult to change your consumption of that. But so overall, summarizing all of that, things have got better, but it's still a really challenging economic backdrop for businesses and households across the north of England to navigate.
One thing I'm always interested in with inflation and cost of living is the extent to which it's felt differently around the country. And I saw some statistics. I think it was from the Centre for Cities, which suggested that there's areas of that there's a bit of a north-south divide in this respect. And I think they singled out places in Lancashire like Blackburn and Blackpool,
Yeah.
places like that, which are inflation is higher there than it is in the southeast for a variety of reasons. So, I mean,
Yes.
is it the case that this, as things hopefully get better, it won't be getting better at the same rate everywhere in the country.
That's correct, and that Centre for Cities analysis is accurate. That we do know that across all households in the UK, they spend about between 10 to 15% on food and energy. But for the poorest 10% of households, which unfortunately some of the areas you describe are in the poorest constituencies across the UK, it's closer to 30, 35, often 40%. And so the fact that those items have gone up the furthest, energy bills more than doubling, food prices up, well, just 19% in just the last year alone, that disproportionately impacts the spending power of those households on what we just call discretionary spending. Things that outside, if you like, the things you have to buy, which often is linked to well-being, people's happiness levels, because GDP, gross domestic product, the output of the UK economy can be quite an abstract concept for a lot of people. But actually making it real is how much money do you have at the end of the month in order to do things that feel like leisure, feel like luxuries, and the degree to which those constituencies you mentioned with lower average incomes that spend a higher proportion on those staples, that means that recovery is going to be more sluggish in those areas.
Which I guess brings us on to the whole topic of levelling up and regional
Mm.
inequalities, which has obviously been a major focus for politics for a few years. Maybe, I don't know, I feel like the focus on it is perhaps waning slightly at the moment. But in terms of, I mean, I'd be interested to know what your view on whether there's any evidence that the northern economy has been leveled up, and the
Mm.
progress toward we're progressing towards a state of affairs where the economy of in northern towns can compete and things are more equal with
Yeah.
London and the southeast. Is that happening in any way that you can see?
Yeah, at the risk of sitting on the fence, and I desperately don't want to sit on the fence, not least because I'll get splinters. But the point is, the data's pretty mixed. There are real bright points. There is data out in the last few hours, actually, recording this podcast about jobs growth in the north and northeast of England that has outstripped the national average. That's encouraging. My own analysis on northern companies that are listed on the stock exchange, they've outperformed over the last 2 to 3 years. That's encouraging. We're also seeing signs that the transition to net zero and the onshoring of industrial and manufacturing capacity from away from the rest of the world, as the global supply chains slightly shorten as a result of the pandemic, disproportionately affects the north. There's the good news. But if I also look at PMIs, these are called purchasing manager indexes. They're your monthly, if you like, health check on how fast each regional economy is growing. London is the fastest growing part of the UK economy at present. And we still have a long dated gap in productivity where London and the southeast is way out ahead, and a few months, a few quarters, even a few years is going to make relatively little dent in what is a big gap in productivity levels between the economy of the southeast and London and the north. So yes, bright spots, but the idea that the northern economy has been leveled up based on last few years of political attention, I think doesn't stand up to scrutiny.
That's really interesting. And I suppose even the staunchest conservative supporters of levelling up would admit that it is a project that will take years, if not decades, to fully come to fruition. I mean, just
Absolutely.
to go back to the good news that you were
Hmm.
talking about, that northern public listed companies
Yeah.
are outperforming UK public companies since the start of 2020. I mean, that seems very encouraging. But why do you think that might be?
Yes, so we have seen a recovery, at least in its initial stages from the pandemic, that was driven by manufacturing, the built environment, the type of economic strength that the north has disproportionate to the south. The south is it's an oversimplification to say the south is a services based economy and the north is a manufacturing economy, but the relative shares of that economic activity are larger in the case of services in the South, London and the Southeast, and manufacturing in the North. And therefore, the fact that during the pandemic, particularly when a lot of services-based activity wasn't possible, a lot of the earnings growth amongst companies was those who could supply goods, manufactured goods, construction goods, the type of activity that households were demanding. There's a bit of a DIY boom, a bit of a consumer durables boom, and a lot of those companies were disproportionately affected in the north. So I think that drove the outperformance. It's encouraging that even as the services based economy has opened up, and indeed that's the part of the economy that is now booming, you still have that outperformance by northern companies listed on the London Stock Exchange, and that is the point of, if you like, going back to my day job at an investment bank, the idea of getting capital investment into all parts of the United Kingdom has to remain a priority through the cycle. Doesn't matter whether Labour are in charge, doesn't matter whether the Tories are in charge, doesn't matter whether there's a coalition. It's that commitment to identifying capital, both public sector capital and my industry, private sector capital, going into those parts of the economy that can sustainably level up living standards, economic potential across the whole country.
And I mean, there's obviously in a couple of budgets ago, Rishi Sunak unveiled the UK Investment Bank, didn't he? Which has its headquarters in Leeds and was set up precisely with that aim in mind. I mean, is that a useful addition to what we've been talking about? Will that have an impact, do you think?
I think it will, if only just to provide some, if you like, anecdotal evidence. I was in seeing officials at the Treasury a few weeks ago, and they specifically referenced that bank based in Leeds as the vehicle that they want to use to funnel investment into the wider UK economy, but clearly its footprint. And I've written quite a lot about this, and I know you've read some of it, Rob, about the importance of place, the importance of having a footprint, a physical footprint in the north of England, which we as a business have done, which the government has increasingly tried to do with its own functions, both in Leeds, in Manchester, and around the north of England, because place really matters. In theory, it shouldn't matter. In practice, it does matter. And so I am encouraged by that. Now, of course, there has to be long-term commitment to channeling that capital into investment projects. And any objective assessment can see that as a country, we've underinvested in our capital stock for 30, 40 years, but disproportionately underinvested in the north of England. That needs probably for 30, 40 years to rebalance in the opposite direction before we can claim, job done.
Yeah, I should probably explain to our listeners who don't know what the UK Infrastructure Bank is. So it was set up by Rishi Sunak when he was Chancellor. It's part of the government's plan to reach net zero carbon by 2050 to support economic growth and in regional and local sectors. And basically, its task is to invest in areas like renewables, carbon capture and storage, and it will hopefully provide low rate loans to mayors and councils to fund projects, and its headquarters is in Leeds. So there were quite high hopes for that. And I'm going to ask you about something that I saw you tweeting about earlier this week, which is an interesting concept that we were talking about on the podcast last week with our guest Ruth Hannon, who's from the People's Powerhouse movement, and it's the concept of universal basic income, because there's a trial going on with that at the moment. A think tank is recruiting people in Jarrow in the northeast, and they're all going to get £1,600 a month, no strings attached, to spend on whatever they want. And Ruth on our podcast last week was saying how this could, obviously we want to see how it's going to work, but the hope is that it could sort of provide a different economic model and help with some of the problems like 0 hours employment and people falling through the gaps of our social security system. But
Mm.
I'm imagining, as an economist, you might have a different view on universal basic income as an idea. Could it work in your view?
No. And that sounds too dismissive, and it probably is too dismissive because, of course, um, the definition of universal basic income is hotly disputed, and the design of how you would give out universal basic income is disputed. I mean, um, many of the proponents of universal basic income might say, well, we'll give £1,600 to everybody across the country, but from millionaires, billionaires, we will tax it at near 100% to make sure that they don't in effect get a £1,600 uplift. But then you've almost taken away the very definition of universal basic income because it isn't universal in terms of the income. And so what economists call that is a deadweight loss. You're giving a lot of public money, because this is ultimately coming from, well, either tax revenue or borrowing, but it's ultimately a liability to households, and giving it to people who on a means tested basis really don't need it, and we call that dead weight. Dead weight, and you have to recognise that by doing introducing dead weight, that is money that otherwise could be spent on more targeted social care, healthcare, education, comes out of other parts of public spending. And so if you like, my cynicism around universal basic income is that most of the sensible proponents of it quickly claw back lot of that universality, and therefore really quite quickly doesn't actually do what it says on the tin.
That's really interesting. Well, I guess that debate will run and run, and we'll be interested to see what the results are from the study. The last thing I'll ask you, Simon, you're from
Yes.
Hull
Yeah.
originally. I don't know how often you get back there, but I'm interested in your view on how your home city is doing. Obviously, it was the city of culture not that long ago. It's got
Yep.
some big, Hull and the Humber region have some really
Mm.
big strengths in terms of green energy, and they've got the awesome power of the River Humber and everything that comes with it. I mean, are
Yeah.
you hopeful as an
Yeah.
economist about
Yeah.
Hull and its prospects?
Well, to answer your question, the first one you said, how often do I get back? 3-4 times a year. I I have a strong affiliation to my home city, and I'm very proud to be from Hull. In terms of its economic advantages, there's one you've already mentioned, which is its potential, and actually its increasingly realized potential as a green energy powerhouse. And I don't use that flippantly. The Europe's largest offshore wind farm built off the Hornsea project off the Holderness coast is hugely relevant to the path of the UK to net zero, and the potential to bolt that green hydrogen potential with the hydrogen industry, which then in effect gives it the storage capacity to smooth out what potentially can produce a lot of supply at times when we don't always need it, but we want to store it for times when the wind isn't blowing. There's the potential for Hull to be at the absolute epicenter, actually, of the UK's net zero journeys. That's very encouraging. The other one that you didn't mention, which I've started to get involved with one of the local Labour MPs from Hull, is the potential for Hull as a remote working capital. Over the last 2 to 3 years, we have seen across not just the UK but across the world a greater adaptation of remote working. And Hull, famously, has is the only city in the UK with 100% fast broadband, super fast broadband. That from the legacy of KCOM, Kingston Communications, and the famous white telephone boxes. That
That
legacy enabled it.
just to stop you there, Simon, just for people who don't know. So Hull
Yes.
uniquely in the country has its sort of its own sort of independent telecoms system,
It
doesn't
does,
it?
yeah.
That's what you're talking about there.
Yeah, absolutely. And why is that relevant? Well, it was a bit of a anachronism when there were white telephone boxes rather than red telephone boxes. I'm showing my age now, aren't I, Rob? But now it provides a combination of, by any objective measure, a low cost of living in terms of housing, excellent connectivity in terms of its broadband and communications, and therefore as a epicenter of somewhere to remote work, with employers based either in higher cost parts of the north in terms of Leeds, Manchester, or indeed from London, but have connectivity into it both remotely and through its transport network. There is a big opportunity as well for Hull to address what for a long time economists have worried about, particularly economists looking at regional disparities: the brain drain, of very, very talented individuals who leave Hull with great earnings potential and go and work and live in other parts of the country. Can they potentially, at least at the margin, be able to do that from Hull? I think the pandemic, one of the legacies, and there have been some terrible legacies of the pandemic, but one of the positive legacies is potentially that makes that more possible with Hull at the vanguard.
That's really interesting because I guess one of the things about Hull is its relative isolation geographically. It's sort of a bit out on a limb, isn't it? But it sounds like from what you're saying that could be almost a strength rather than a weakness.
Yes, yeah, I think so.
Absolutely. Well, high hopes for Hull. It's always a good to end on a positive note. Simon French from Panmure Gordon. Thank you so much.
My pleasure, Rob.